I've decided
Oh my.
So I went home and Vernon, not Vernon, Frank was there.
Where's Joan?
look at these people.
She's in Danville.
Oh.
Danville.
So you were home alone at Christmas with no mom and sister?
No mom and no
Or
dad.
dad?
The house was empty. But Frank was there. He came every day. And I said, Frank, would you help me get the tree out? And he went up the attic and got the tree up, set the whole thing up, and then he was dead.
Why did he come home? Oh. What day?
I don't really know what I'm doing. Don't tell anybody. Pursuant to the collusion illustrated between the Justice Department and the too-big-to-fail banks, there has been an elaborate relationship between the Department of Treasury and the too-big-to-fail banks to quietly kill the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mind you, that the previous head of the FHFA, prior to being head of the FHFA, was working for the U.S. Treasury. So he went from the U.S. Treasury to the head of the FHFA, and then basically enacted agreements to take all of the money from private businesses and give them to the U.S. Treasury, which is illegal. As you likely know, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac provide the government-sponsored insurance that makes a 30-year mortgage affordable for middle-income Americans to access the housing market to begin to aggregate wealth. In 2008, then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson used the power of his office and the engulfing fear of the burgeoning fiscal meltdown to take over the GSEs against their consent. They did not request a bailout, and the bailout was not approved or even voted on. Keep in mind, they're privately owned, and the owners of the stock still own stock. I'm one of them. Paulson ordered the GSEs to purchase billions of dollars in toxic assets from the too-big-to-fail banks at 100% face value, which was an additional bailout to the banks in addition to the TARP funds. This was all possible because the Treasury directed the FHFA, which is the GSE's government regulator, to change a major accounting rule which overnight charged the balance sheets of the GSEs from solvent to insolvent. To purchase these loans, the GSEs were forced to borrow billions of dollars from Treasury. In exchange, it had to provide Treasury warrants, free stock options, for 79.9% of the company. In addition, the GSEs were ordered to pay 10% interest on the money they were forced to borrow from Treasury. All of this is public information, and Paulson gloated about this takeover in his autobiography. Responding to then President Bush, who asked how all this was being accomplished, Paulson stated, "They won't even hear the heads hit the floor," in reference to his attempted killing of the GSEs. Why would Paulson want to kill the GSEs? Private mortgage-backed securities. Prior to the collapse, the too-big-to-fail banks had been venturing into the mortgage world with private mortgage-backed securities, basically low-quality loans that the GSEs wouldn't purchase due to the credit risk, but were very profitable to the banks as long as the loans didn't default. These are the loans you read about, the Alt-A and the subprime, no down payment, interest-only loans with huge ballooning adjustable rates. These loans were designed to keep people in their newly purchased homes for 5 to 7 years, and then to hopefully and slowly allow for the repossession resale when the balloon adjustment rate kicked in and caused the home to be repossessed by the bank. Obviously, this very profitable scheme went off the rails and mass foreclosure hits because too many too-big-to-fail banks got involved in the scam. As the financial crisis reached its peak, all the private mortgage-backed securities left the market and the GSEs were the only game in town. The GSEs are a counter-cyclical business. When everything else fails, you need somebody out there to be able to provide loans for 30-year mortgages. They're a necessity for the American dream. As the only game in town for Americans seeking financial purchase of a home during the crisis, the GSEs, which were and still are under conservatorship of the Treasury via the FHFA, clawed their way back to profitability. By this time, President Bush was long gone and President Obama had diligently worked to steer the American economy back onto the road. Unfortunately, President Obama's Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner was another Wall Street stooge and had convinced his boss that the GSEs were part of the 2008 meltdown. Wall Street hitman Ed DeMarco had been installed as the director of the FHFA, the agency tasked with overseeing the conservatorship and regulation of the GSEs. Mind you, this guy previously worked at the U.S. Treasury. He was taken from the U.S. Treasury and put into the head of the FHFA. DeMarco and Geithner met during a series of meetings in late 2011 and early 2012 that had recently been discovered via FOIA, I think that's Freedom of Information Act, in the Treasury Secretary's schedule. You can look at their schedule. We now know that Geithner and DeMarco were discussing a modification to the conservatorship agreement that controlled the GSEs that had never been agreed to by the GSEs in the first place. And in early 2012, the FHFA, Ed DeMarco, who was previously working at the U.S. Treasury, acting on behalf of the GSEs as their conservator, decided that it would be in the best interest of the GSEs to start paying the Treasury 100% of their proceeds rather than the 10% dividend. Illegal. Of course, all the additional money to the GSEs, the GSEs were forced to borrow from Treasury was then subject to the 10% dividend. This was the previous agreement. Did I mention that the terms of the loan from the U.S. Treasury stipulate that all money paid back to the U.S. Treasury are interest and do not apply to principal? You read that right. The GSEs have no mechanism to pay back the principal to Treasury. Geithner, DeMarco, Treasury, and FHFA all state that they entered into the net worth sweep to save the GSEs from having to become further indebted to the Treasury, and all their models showed the GSEs not being profitable ever. Wouldn't you be surprised to know that the GSEs became wildly profitable just 2 months after the 100% net worth sweep was implemented? Ta-da! President Obama may have come to his senses in 2013 and realized that Wall Street had basically talked them into doing away with the GSEs. The administration changed courses and DeMarco was forced out as director of the FHFA, using controversial recess appointment. And I think on top of that, I think there were threats to DeMarco by people that worked with him, like death threats. I don't know, and I also think that there may have been deaths. Like, I remember reading something to some sort of extent like that. Quite possibly. I'm never sure. Using a controversial recess appointment, the administration installed former Congressman Melvin Watt as the new director. Director Watt seems to be working behind the scenes to recapitalize and preserve the GSEs, but he is facing stiff resistance from Wall Street interests. As it stands, the GSEs have paid back $218 billion against $189 billion borrowed, and the amount paid back will increase shortly at the close of 2014 fourth quarter. That ends today. Happy New Year for those of you who yeah. The GSEs continue to operate with zero cash reserve, a very dangerous play for the 25% of the nation's economy, basically walking without any type of safety net. That argument is nah. But I will say that I do think it is moral hazard to allow the GSEs to operate in conservatorship as opposed to out of conservatorship. I think that allowing the government to unilaterally make decisions in this arena is not the most effective way to engage in providing mortgage affordability to better enable and enhance pursuers of the American dream and consumers. If you ask Rep. Ed Royce of California, the GSEs haven't paid back one damn cent. If you ask Senator Charles Schumer, the GSEs have paid back the Treasury in full. Community bank organizations, credit unions, civil rights groups, and various others have been lobbying the Obama administration and Congress for GSE's release. Too big to fail mouthpieces like the Wall Street Journal and the American Enterprise Institute have continued to lobby for their elimination. John Carney, I'm calling you out. You make me so happy because you provide the most reasonable, balanced perspective that I have ever seen that allows for the justification of the two most profitable businesses in the world of 2013 to be valued with a market capitalization of 0. I am so incredibly impressed with your mathematical talent and your law degree and your ability to derive these conclusions that will happen at some point in the future and parlay your success of recent due to lower recent stock prices to contribute to your own internal validation that you must be right, and to sell that to people that may not know about this like you or I do, as if "2015 looks like it will see a conclusion in one direction or the other." Representative Jeb Harnsling out of Texas, who will be the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, recently asked the CBO to produce a report on what housing would look like if the GSEs were no longer on the scene. The parameters of the scenario Henseling asked the CBO to generate were designed to make it look like the GSE's elimination wouldn't be a big deal, and the private-backed mortgage securities would step in to replace the GSEs with affordable home mortgages. Nothing is farther from the truth.